Hey there. Tonight we're setting aside the shining armor and glorious battles. No trumpets, no feasts, no noble oaths echoing through marble halls, because this story isn't about honor. It's about weight, iron, blood, silence. It's about what it really meant to carry a sword in the Middle Ages. Not in the songs, but in the cold, in the mud, in the hours no one ever wrote down. So get comfortable, dim your lights, and listen closely. Because not every night lived long enough to be remembered, and some of them prayed they wouldn't be. Sir Edric of Thornmere had not unsaddled in 3 days. His horse, a mottled gray beast more bone than muscle, stumbled as they crossed the hill's crest into the valley below. Edric didn't blame the animal. He hadn't slept either. The land was quiet. Not peaceful, just emptied. Villages sat hollowed out, fires long cold, windows gaping like broken mouths. Fields lay overgrown with weeds, roads lost to mud. War had passed through here not like a storm, but like a rot, slow, chewing, patient. Behind him rode no army. Just two squires, both too young to understand the weight of their tabards. One carried his shield, its sigil stained and cracked. The other dragged the banner, its fabric torn and unreadable in the wind. Edric wore his armor still, not out of pride, but necessity. Underneath, his skin festered with sores. He'd stopped bleeding at the neck 3 days ago. He suspected the wound had simply run dry. At the edge of the village square stood a well, and beside it a single figure, an old woman hunched beneath a black shawl. She watched him without blinking as he dismounted, boots sinking into the wet earth. "This is Greyvale?" he asked. The woman didn't nod, didn't speak. She only pointed toward the church, half collapsed, its bell tower twisted sideways like a snapped wrist. He found the villagers in the crypt, 57 of them. They'd sealed themselves inside with the dead. Children curled against stone, elders with hands clasped in prayer, all still, all silent. No sign of slaughter, no signs of struggle, just bones, neatly stacked, as if waiting. That night, Edric dreamed of fire, but not the kind that burned, the kind that hummed, quietly, beneath the skin. And when he woke, his sword hand was clenched so tightly around the hilt that his fingernails had broken off. The blade was warm. He hadn't drawn it. And outside, something had scratched a message into the door of the church. 4 words, written in perfect Latin. "Your oath has been heard." The message was shallow, but deliberate, scratched clean through wet wood with something sharp enough to leave no splinters. The edges were dry. It hadn't been done that night. It had been waiting. His squires refused to enter the church. One claimed the stone inside whispered. The other said he saw the statue of the Virgin weep dust. Edric didn't correct them. He had seen worse. But even he hesitated before crossing the threshold again. This time he noticed the incense. Not the sweet kind used in blessing rites, but a bitter, sharp odor like scorched herbs and rusted iron. It clung to the stone, stale and stubborn, like a memory that refused to fade. The bones in the crypt had shifted. He was sure of it. What had been a pile now formed a rough circle. At its center, something small rested on a bed of clean linen, a child's wooden toy horse, carved crudely but still intact. Someone had placed it there recently. Outside, the old woman was still by the well. "Did you bury them?" he asked. She looked up. Her eyes were milky but unblinking. "They buried themselves," she said. "How?" They knew the night was coming. Edric felt the ache rise again behind his eyes, the deep throb of something unhealed. "I came to protect them." "You came with fire," she replied, "as you did in Brambleholt, as you did in Care's Hollow." He staggered back a step. "You don't know those names." She tilted her head. "The ground does." The squires had packed by nightfall, said little, just loaded the mules, left Edric's armor leaning against the church wall like a second broken body. They wanted to ride north, someplace where the air didn't taste like ash. Edric remained. He sat by the well until the stars came out, watching the sky shift and blink and settle into its 1,000-year stare. The wind had changed, less cold now, more curious, like something was watching through the trees. He drank once from the well. The water tasted of iron, and when he looked up again, the statue of St. Cillian had turned. Not fully, just enough that its eyes no longer looked at heaven, but at him. And in that moment, Edric remembered what his mentor had said the day he first put on the armor. Knighthood is not a gift. It's a weight you carry until it bends you into someone else. The armor still leaned by the chapel. He didn't put it back on. He didn't need to. It followed him anyway. Edric hadn't spoken in a day and a half. His mouth was dry, lips split from the wind. But that wasn't why. Words had no power here, not anymore. The statue of St. Cillian remained turned. Its stone hand, once lifted in silent benediction, now pointed toward the woods behind the chapel. That hand had once cradled a book of judgment. The book was gone. In its place, a hollow like something had been torn free. He remembered a story, one told long ago in a candlelit barracks filled with drunk men trying to laugh their shame away, about a saint who judged not by scripture but by weight. Every knight who came to him brought tokens of valor, shields, coins, sacred relics, but the saint never smiled, until one man came with nothing but a severed hand. "He's the only one the saint let pass," the old commander had said. The hand had held no blade, no coin, no banner, only the truth. Edric rose slowly from the well's edge and followed the stone finger into the trees. The forest had grown thicker overnight. What was once a path was now overrun with brambles, though none cut him. They bent just slightly, letting him through, brushing against his surcoat like curious hands. The farther he went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, only the sound of his own breath, and even that began to feel like an intrusion. Then he found the circle. 7 stones, blackened with soot, arranged in a ring around a burned patch of earth. At the center stood a sword, not his own, but ancient, rusted, wide-bladed, buried halfway to the hilt in scorched soil. The air shimmered faintly around it as if the ground were still hot, and it was humming. Not loudly, not with malice, just resonating, like something old and wounded trying to speak without a voice. Edric stepped forward, his feet sunk slightly. The earth here remembered fire. He reached out, not to pull the sword free, but to touch the hilt. His fingers burned, not with heat, but memory, a battlefield, a child screaming, the smell of wet straw and burning hair, a bell that never rang in time. He recoiled. The sword did not move. The hum grew louder, and from the woods far behind him a whisper rose. Not in words, but in judgment. He turned. The statue was there, not stone, not saint, something else. It did not speak. It only watched, waiting. Edric did not run. He had tried that once before, on a hill outside Dunlath, where the cries of the dying outlasted the smoke. Running didn't save you. It just gave the guilt time to catch up. The figure before him was shaped like St. Cillian, but taller. The robes flowed like cloth, but never moved. The face was blank, smooth stone where features should be, save for a single mark carved deep into the forehead. A sword turned downward, bisecting a crown. He stood frozen as the wind circled the grove like breath. The hum from the buried blade had become a rhythm now, pulsing softly beneath his feet. A heartbeat not his own. The trees leaned inward, the sky seemed farther away. The figure raised its arm, and Edric felt his legs move, not of will but obedience. Like a child summoned by a disappointed father, he stepped into the ring of blackened stones, the ground soft and warm. Beneath the soil, something ancient shifted. "You swore," a voice said, not from the figure but from the air. It was not angry, not cruel, just certain. "You swore and you broke." Edric tried to speak. Nothing came. "You bore the sword in the name of kings and carved silence into the mouths of the wronged." The trees exhaled. Bark cracked. 1,000 eyes seemed to open in the canopy above. "You left fire in your wake, called it duty, called it God, called it order." The figure stepped forward. The earth did not tremble, but Edric did. "What do you call it now?" The sword in the center pulsed once, then stilled. Edric sank to his knees, his breath clouded in the cooling air. The memories, he couldn't stop them. A girl's voice, begging not for mercy, but for her name to be spoken one last time. A mother clutching a burned doll. A squire who had died not by blade, but by example. "I remember them," he whispered. And the wind answered, "So do we." The earth cracked. Just a hairline at first beneath the sword's hilt, then spreading, like ink spilled on parchment. From within, a glow, pale, cold, white. And the sword began to rise, but it wasn't lifted, it chose to rise. And it turned, blade down, hilt up, toward Edric, an offering or a sentence. He looked to the figure. It did not move, only watched. The grove waited with it. Edric stared at the sword. It hovered just above the cracked earth, steady, quiet, weightless, and yet every fiber in his body told him it was heavy. Not with steel, but with memory. He didn't reach for it, not yet. The last time he'd taken a blade without question, it had earned him titles, blood-stained gold, and the screams that still echoed through his dreams. But this sword, this was not a reward. It was an invitation and a test. The figure across the circle had not moved. It had no need to. Its presence was not bound to limbs or motion. It was the embodiment of reckoning. The silence after a wrong goes unanswered for too long. You must take it, the wind whispered. Not aloud. Not in any voice. The words came like pressure in the skull, like the taste of iron on the tongue. Edric's hand trembled as he reached forward. The moment his skin brushed the hilt, the grove vanished. Not literally. But he was no longer standing among trees. He stood in a chapel. The very one he burned at 23 by order of Baron Calden. The same chapel where a dozen women had hidden beneath the altar, accused of sorcery because they used herbs and prayed in a forgotten tongue. He remembered the smell of oil on wood. He remembered the way the screams turned hoarse, then stopped. But now it was not fire that filled the space. It was light. Each woman stood around him. Not ghostly. Not decayed, just present, eyes open, watching. They said nothing. He dropped to his knees. I knew, he choked out. I knew it wasn't justice. The vision shifted. A battlefield, his first, flags torn by wind. A boy not older than 16 lay gasping in the mud, chest open, breath wet and shallow. Edric had stepped over him. He had to. Orders were to press forward. Now he stood again over that body. The boy looked up. His lips moved. And this time Edric heard it. You wore silver, so I thought I was safe. When he blinked, he was back in the grove. The sword now in his grasp, it pulsed once in his palm, a quiet, almost kind pulse, like a heartbeat matching his own. The figure lowered its arm. You remember, it said, not with approval, but with acknowledgement. The blade dimmed. The earth stilled. The trees at last were silent, but the wind left him with one final whisper. Now, carry it properly. The sword was colder than any Edric had ever held. Not icy, empty, as if it had never been forged, only found, pulled from a place where pain turned to metal and memory to edge. The hilt bore no crest, no noble family, no king's blessing, just worn leather smoothed by hands long since dust. He walked out of the grove alone. The forest didn't resist his passing now. Branches moved aside, roots seemed to ease beneath his feet, and though no sun pierced the canopy, he could still see, just enough. By dusk, the village returned, or rather, he returned to it. But something had changed. The church door stood open. Light flickered within, not candlelight, not firelight, but something dimmer and more constant. A steady glow that pulsed like a living breath. His armor was gone. Where it had once rested, there now stood a figure draped in chainmail and gray wool. A mirror of himself, but younger, unscarred. Clean tabard, gleaming steel, proud stance. The boy he used to be. It raised its head and Edric gasped. It was him. The face that hadn't yet seen real war. The eyes that still believed in honor, in duty, in kings. The version of himself that had once wept during prayer and thought that meant he was good. The sword in Edric's hand pulsed. The younger Edric stepped forward, drawing a blade, a pristine longsword, polished and eager. The two stared at each other in silence. Then, the boy asked, in a voice untainted by time, "Why did you change?" Edric's answer came low. Because no one told us what the oath really meant. The boy's grip tightened. We wanted to serve. Yes, Edric nodded, and they used that. Behind the boy, the light in the church dimmed. The bell began to toll slowly, though no one pulled the rope. Each strike echoed not through air, but through memory. Each chime a moment he had long buried, the condemned screaming his name. A village gate burned shut, the look in a healer's eyes before the rope took her, the silence afterward. You left them, the boy said. I did, Edric whispered. Do you regret it? He didn't answer right away. Then, I regret not understanding sooner. The boy's blade lowered. The glow behind him faded, and in his place, only Edric's old armor remained. Empty, rusted, folded neatly on the chapel step. He approached and knelt, laid the new blade across it. Then he rose without a weapon, without a sigil, and for the first time in years he felt human. Edric left the village at dawn, not because he was finished, but because he finally understood he never would be. The weight he carried now wasn't strapped to his back or sheathed at his side. It lived inside him, deep and settled, like old iron in water. The road south was long and cracked, veined with weeds. He passed no other travelers, no carts, no soldiers, only crows, more than usual, perched along the trees and fence posts, watching, waiting. They did not caw. They only observed as if keeping tally. He avoided the main roads and the stone keeps, places where people might still remember his name. He had not spoken it in days, and it felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. Maybe it did. A week passed, maybe more. He stopped counting. Then, one evening, beneath the shadow of a crumbling aqueduct, he met a man with no eyes. The man sat by a ruined fire pit, robes tattered, feet bare. His face was bandaged and linen yellowed with age, but he turned toward Edric as if he could see. "You've buried something," the man said without preamble. Edric didn't sit. "Many things. Not in the ground." Edric hesitated. "I tried to walk away from it." The blind man smiled. "You're not walking away. You're circling it. The only road now is through." Edric studied the man's hands. Nails chipped, palms blistered. A pilgrim? A madman? A prophet? Hard to tell these days. "What are you?" Edric asked. The man tilted his head. "A reminder." "Of what?" "That even ashes leave shadows." The wind stirred the leaves, a long sigh through the empty arches above. "You killed for kings," the man said. Edric didn't flinch. "I did." "You knelt for priests." "I did." "You obeyed your vows." "I tried." The man nodded, slowly. "Then it's not the killing that haunts you." Edric looked down. His hands were empty, but they still felt blood-warm. "It's who you became to do it," the man finished. Silence stretched between them, heavy, whole. Then the blind man reached into the fire pit and drew out a shard of black glass. Charred, jagged, sharp. He held it out. "Take it," he said. "Not to fight, not to wound, but to remember." Edric did. The glass shimmered in the twilight, not like steel, but like memory. Faint images danced across it, faces, fields, flames. None stayed long, none would ever stay long again. When he looked up, the man was gone, and Edric was alone again, but not the same. The shard of glass stayed with Edric, tucked into the folds of his cloak like a wound too valuable to leave behind. It had no use, could not be wielded or bartered, but it hummed with something that felt like truth. Not noble, not redemptive, just honest. He wandered southward, deeper into the borderlands, where maps thinned and the woods swallowed roads without apology. The villages here were smaller, poorer, untouched by the war in which Edric had once played a polished part. They didn't recognize him. That was good. He offered no name, took no coin, just work. He dug graves in one hamlet, gathered leeches in another, and in the town of Hareth's Hollow he found a bakery that still stood, warm and stubborn despite the rot eating at its walls. The baker was old and nearly blind. He needed hands to keep the ovens hot. Edric volunteered. It was quiet work. No metal, no blood. Just heat and dough and the strange grace of watching flour become something worth sharing. His hands, once skilled at unmaking, learned to make. But the nights were hardest. He slept beside the hearth under a wool sheet and a conscience that never quieted. Sometimes he woke choking on smoke that wasn't there. Sometimes, in dreams, his armor walked without him, clanging hollow, dragging a sword that left no mark but killed just the same. And sometimes the bread whispered, not with words, but with memory. One morning, while stoking the coals, he found a small coin embedded in the ash. Silver, bent, stamped with the crest of the same barony he had once raised for a failed tithe. He stared at it for a long time. "Payment?" the baker asked, voice thin with age. "No," Edric said quietly. "Debt." He didn't keep it. Instead, he buried the coin beneath the stone hearth, deep where the fire could never reach. And when he finished, he rested the shard of black glass beside it. He could feel it tremble. That night, the fire burned brighter. No wood added, no kindling stirred. Just light, steady and patient. And for the first time in weeks, Edric slept without dreaming. The baker died 2 days later, quietly, naturally. Edric wrapped the body in cloth, dug a grave behind the bakery, and marked it with a single loaf of bread, unbaked, left to rise under the open sky. Then he moved on. The road didn't ask questions, but the crows followed, and somewhere behind him in the ash and stone a faint glow still pulsed. It began with the sound of metal, faint, distant, rhythmic, like armor shifting in slow, deliberate motion. Edric had left Hareth's Hollow 2 weeks past, following a narrow river south, where the trees grew taller and the villages farther apart. He hadn't seen another soul in days, but the sound followed him, always just out of sight, a scraping, a dragging, sometimes the soft clink of chainmail settling like breath. By the third night, he stopped pretending he was alone. He didn't make a fire, didn't sleep. He waited. And just before dawn, when the frost was beginning to loosen from the leaves, he saw it. Standing across the river, half shrouded in mist, was his old armor. It didn't wear a body. It was the body. Every plate, every buckle, every link of chain was where it had always been, clean, whole, gleaming like polished gilt. It stood facing him, unmoving, empty, and yet not hollow. Edric rose slowly. He didn't call out, didn't challenge. He simply stood, one hand resting by his side, the other on the hilt of nothing. He carried no blade now, only calluses. The armor took a step forward. The river between them steamed. Another step. Closer. Edric didn't back away. "What do you want?" The armor said nothing, but the air grew heavier, as if the silence were pressing inward, searching him, peeling him open. "You're not mine anymore," Edric said. The armor tilted its helm, just slightly. Not confused, curious. "You were forged for a man who thought duty was blind, who called obedience a virtue. That man died, in fire, in blood, in shame." The armor took one more step. Then it stopped. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Edric said, softer this time, "You are not what I carry now." The armor did not vanish. It crumbled, one plate at a time, like rust undone by memory. The helm folded, the chest plate cracked. The greaves fell into the mist with a sound like glass breaking beneath snow. And then it was gone. All that remained was the faint outline of a body in frost on the grass, and Edric alone again, lighter. Not healed, but less burdened. He crossed the river before the sun had risen fully, and never looked back. But he kept walking, not away from the past, but toward the place where reckoning becomes choice. The road curved southeast, skirting the edge of the old salt marshes where no maps held detail and the fog seemed to breathe. Edric's steps grew quieter here, more deliberate, not because of fear, but because silence had become part of him, a language he now understood. In a town called Marnwick, if it could still be called a town, he found a chapel missing half its roof. Ivy climbed the altar, and the pews had rotted into twisted bones of wood. Yet candles still burned, dozens, maybe hundreds, each one flickering without wind. No priest, no people, just flame. He stepped inside without speaking. The air was warm, not with fire, but with memory. He recognized the feeling. This was a place where people had hoped long after they stopped believing. Edric walked to the altar, past candles etched with names he couldn't read, some written in charcoal, some carved into the wax by shaking fingers. And in the very center, resting on a cracked stone bowl, lay a single piece of iron, a nail. Not a relic, a weapon. Bent, blood-stained, old. He reached for it, and the chapel sighed. Not a wind, not a voice, but a release. Like breath held for too long finally leaving the lungs, Edric touched the nail and was elsewhere. A field. Summer. Wheat bending under the sun. A man knelt in chains, not begging, not afraid, just tired. A knight stood above him. Edric, younger, sharper, eyes hard like frost. "I was told you defied the tithe," young Edric said. "I did," the man replied. "You withheld bread during famine. I kept it so my daughter wouldn't die." Young Edric raised his blade. The man didn't move. Edric remembered this moment, but in truth he had never seen it. Now he did. The way the man looked past him, toward the trees, toward a shape hiding there. A girl, thin, pale, crying into her hands. And how Edric, the Edric of that moment, swung anyway. The vision vanished. He was back in the chapel, the nail still in his hand. But now there was blood on the stone bowl. His. A single drop from his palm. He hadn't felt the cut. He didn't bandage it. Instead, he placed the nail back on the altar and whispered, "I remember." The flames in the chapel rose, not high, not wild, but warm. For a moment, they burned without smoke, without shadow. And he knew. The weight he carried could not be undone. But it could be used. When Edric stepped out of the chapel, the fog did not greet him. It parted, respectfully, as if aware of what had just taken place within those ruined walls. The wind, once listless and low, held its breath, and the path ahead was clearer than it had been in days. But Edric did not walk quickly. He felt it, the slow ache deep in his chest, like the dull bruise of an old oath resurfaced. His hands still bore the thin red line where the nail had kissed him. It hadn't scabbed. It simply remained, as if the blood had chosen not to clot until he was done remembering. He passed no one. Even the birds, those hardy gray scavengers of the marshland, had gone quiet. Beyond the salt marshes, the land rose into dry, chalky hills dotted with dying pines. There stood what once had been a garrison tower, long crumbled now, its bones bleached by rain and neglect. Edric approached it slowly, guided not by duty, but by pull, the quiet magnetism of places tied to things unspoken. Within the broken teeth of the tower's outer wall, he found a rusted shield half buried in dirt. It bore no crest, no color, just the circular dent of an arrowhead, still wedged there, as if whoever had carried it hadn't thought to remove it before laying it down forever. He did not pick it up. He sat beside it. And for the first time since his knighthood, Edric allowed the silence to speak before him. He closed his eyes, resting his back against the tower stone, and waited, not for a memory this time, but for the space left behind when one departs. The hollow, echoing space in the soul. And it came. The sound of breathless armor. A boy's laugh. His own, maybe 16, echoing in the courtyard of some nameless keep, sword too long for his arm, helmet falling into his eyes. A voice saying, "That's the king's new hound." Another replying, "He'll bite his own tail before he tastes blood," then screams, and horses, and the taste of ash, and the things he had done. Not by command, but by instinct. The instinct bred into them all, that obedience was honor, that mercy was weakness, that silence was loyalty. His eyes opened slowly. The fog had returned, not as blindness, but as veil. He stood, knees stiff, and reached into his satchel. He removed the book he had begun weeks ago, pages worn from damp and travel. He turned to the next blank sheet and wrote one line. "A knight forgets what his armor once weighed until he wears no armor at all." He left the book there, upon the stone, beside the shield and the dented arrow. Let someone else read it, or let it rot. Either way, it had been said. And Edric, no longer sir, no longer servant, stepped into the mist once more. He did not know where he was going, but he was no longer following orders. He was following the silence. The fog swallowed him gently, like an old friend reluctant to let go. It curled around Edric's limbs, wound through his cloak, and cooled the fever still lingering behind his eyes. He did not resist it. There was no battle left to win, no banner left to bear. And in truth, there hadn't been for some time. Only now did his soul understand what his body had long since learned. The path led downward, though no path could be seen. Only the slight tilt of the land and the memory of footsteps taken by others long ago. The soil here was pale and loose, and the stones bore the rust stains of iron long buried and long wept over. Spears and swords once lay beneath this ground, but the earth had swallowed them all in time, as it does with everything that bleeds. At the foot of the slope he came to a small grove. The trees were thin, silver-barked and leafless, yet not dead, merely resting. Their shapes were still, but their branches seemed to gesture upward in quiet, pleading surrender. Between them stood a single bench carved from stone, and beside it a wooden post no higher than his waist. A knight's post. He recognized it immediately. Where squires tied their master's horse before a duel, where a sword would be laid when a challenge was made, where names were carved for those who did not return. He approached slowly. The post was covered in moss, but beneath the green he saw it, the shallow etchings of letters nearly lost to time. Some names were foreign, some familiar. One made his breath still. Ravian, his brother. Not by blood, but blood had mixed between them often enough to matter. Edric sank onto the stone bench, his legs shaking from the weight of memory. The last time he had seen Ravian, it had been morning, cold, clear, a sky like polished iron. They were sharpening blades side by side, the way they always had. Silent, focused, not because they had nothing to say, but because what they might say would matter too much. Ravian had tied his braid higher than usual that day. His saddle had been cleaned twice. His gloves mended. They both knew. Neither said it. And by dusk, Ravian was just a sound behind a hill. A sound Edric had followed too slowly. He had never found the body. But now, here was the post, and the name. And here he sat, with no sword, no banner, no cause, only a bell still hidden in his satchel, a bell that had not rung for days, and a red thread wrapped in cloth that no longer tugged. Edric placed both upon the bench beside him, and then, without ceremony, he reached into the earth. No spade, no prayer, just his fingers in the soil, turning it open gently, patiently. When he had dug deep enough, he placed the bell in the hollow, then the thread. Then he covered them again with earth and moss and silence. He did not mark it. He did not speak. The bench would remember, the post would remain. The names, carved in the grain of time, would hold what words could not. And Edric stood once more, a man without steel. The weight was still there. But it was no longer armor, it was memory, and it walked beside him quietly into the night. The land was soft beneath Edric's feet now. He no longer heard the heavy clink of his own gear with every step, only the low hush of grass bending under worn leather, and the faint sigh of his own breath dissolving into mist. He had not drawn a blade in weeks. Not since the fire in the high village, not since the woman with the burnt hands had looked at him and said, "You were too late, but still, you came." And somehow, that had undone something in him. Not with anger, not with shame, just the quiet grief of realizing that even arrival had its weight. Ahead, the world opened into a wide moor, colorless and vast, tufted with low, wind-tattered grass and distant stone circles, the kind no one spoke about anymore. He had known this land as a boy. It had frightened him then. It frightened him still, but differently now. Not as a place of ghosts, but of truths too large to bear out loud. In the center of the moor stood the remains of an old war tent. Its canvas was ragged, half fallen in upon itself, its poles broken or rotted. Yet it stood, a relic of some forgotten skirmish or encampment, once filled with orders and discipline, now only silence. Edric approached it slowly, unsure why his feet carried him there. Inside, the floor was mud and ash, and scattered along it were rusted daggers, bones of small fires, broken flagons. And in the far corner, pinned to the last remaining wall of canvas, hung a sword. It was not beautiful. The blade was chipped and blotched with rust, its hilt wrapped in old cloth that had darkened with years of sweat. A training blade, maybe, or one given to a squire who never had time to outgrow it. Beneath the sword, painted on the fabric in faded ochre, was a single phrase: "Not all oaths are meant to last a lifetime." Edric stared at it for a long time. His hand did not reach for the sword. He sat instead, cross-legged in the damp earth, folding his cloak beneath him and closed his eyes. He listened, not for danger, not for command, but for that quiet thread of breath and earth and memory that had begun guiding him through the long days and longer nights. He thought of the boy he had once been, the page, the squire, the eager son of a farmer who had prayed to trade his plow for a blade, and he wondered if that boy would have wept to see the man he had become, or if he would have wept more to know what the blade would take from him. He opened his eyes. The sky was turning, not brighter, just different. A pale, colorless light pushing faintly against the edge of fog. The wind no longer hissed. It moved with a strange gentleness, almost reverence, as if honoring the stillness he carried now. Edric stood once more and stepped from the tent, leaving the sword behind. He walked without armor, without title. But he did not walk alone. The weight that followed him now was not forged of steel, but of memory, regret, and quiet truths. And they did not clang as he walked, they whispered. Beyond the moor, the land sank into a long, low valley where nothing grew anymore. Once it had been barley fields, golden and swaying in the wind like a slow, living sea. But the war had passed through here. Not the kind with banners or horns, but the quieter kind, the slow, creeping one. The kind that leaves behind salt in the soil and silence in the cottages. Edric walked its empty length. The ground here was cracked in places, white with old frost that never truly melted. Fences still stood, barely, leaning like drunks toward the horizon. The old mill by the stream had no wheel now, just a rotting frame and a door swinging listlessly in the wind. The air smelled of ash and dried mud, touched with the faint, bitter edge of something long decayed. He passed a tree that still bore ribbons, faded now, limp and colorless. A blessing tree. Each knot a prayer for sons returned, for harvest spared, for death to be painless. No one had come to cut them down. They'd been left to flutter until even the wind forgot them. He paused there, not to tie a ribbon, but to rest beneath the quiet limbs. His legs ached, not from age, but from burden, from walking without a purpose that could be spoken aloud. The tree did not shade him. The branches were too thin, but it watched him, and in its watching he felt allowed to remember. He thought again of Ravian, of the sound of sword tips dragging behind them as they returned from that last raid, of how the moon had looked like a cracked coin in the sky that night. He thought of the boy at the bridge, the one they'd left behind, and the vow he'd made not aloud but somewhere deeper. If I forget him, let my hand forget the sword. And so here he was, his sword forgotten, his hand free. But the boy's face had never left him. He rose after a time and stepped once more into the field, where blackened stubble rose like broken teeth through the soil. He knelt there and pressed his palm to the dirt. "Nothing grows here," he said softly. The land did not reply, but he did not expect it to. The quiet was enough. He stood again and walked onward, not with purpose, but with witness. And behind him, though the soil remained barren, a single ribbon on the tree stirred. Not with wind, but with memory. The valley narrowed into a sunken path, and Edric followed its curve like a line drawn by the finger of a god too tired to speak. The air was thin here, quiet not from stillness, but from something deeper, the kind of silence that hangs over graveyards forgotten by their mourners. His boots sank slightly with each step, not in mud, but in something looser. Time, perhaps, or the sifted remains of dreams too heavy to carry forward. He came upon a row of stones, unmarked, unarranged. Not graves, at least not properly, just stones, set into the ground by hands that knew they'd never return to finish the work. Children, maybe. Villagers, soldiers, or the ones left after soldiers moved on. He did not need names to know the shape of sorrow they held. The wind here did not move. The sky above was the color of boiled bone, tinged faintly green, as if the world itself were holding its breath. And so he stopped. He sat beside the first stone and removed his gloves, letting the cold bite into the scarred skin beneath. His hands, once skilled, once praised, were now nothing more than maps of what had been taken. By sword, by labor, by regret. He placed one hand on the stone, and he whispered, "I don't know who you were, but I was told once that we all fight for the same thing in the end, even if we can't name it." His voice did not carry. It folded into the air like cloth laid gently over the dead. He remained there a long while. And as the light shifted, a strange, sickly glow that neither brightened nor faded, he remembered a night on another field, years ago, where stars had risen in the eyes of dying men, where someone, laughing through blood, had said, "I hope heaven smells like hay." Edric hadn't laughed. He just wiped the man's face and said nothing. Because what words does a knight offer a man who's been stabbed by the very sword he trained him to use? They had all believed the stars would outlive them, but some were buried right here. Not with ceremony, not with mourning. Just a stone. And silence. Edric stood at last and continued on. The path curved sharply into a low wooded glen, the trees blackened at the root as though touched by old fire. The air was thicker here, tinged with damp rot and the bitter scent of mold growing on things long forgotten. At the center of the glen was a well. Its stones were intact, its cover still in place, but the rope was frayed and the bucket was missing. Moss climbed the sides like hands, gripping the edge with silent desperation. He approached. On the wood of the cover, someone had carved a single phrase. "She never drank." That was all. No name, no context, just those 3 words. And yet the image bloomed painfully in Edric's mind. A girl, maybe no older than 13, standing here with a bucket too heavy for her arms, waiting for a father who never returned. Or perhaps she stood alone, refusing water because it was meant for a brother or a mother or a knight passing through. The world was filled with acts of quiet defiance no one ever sang about. He sat beside the well and closed his eyes. The red thread in his pouch stirred faintly, though no wind touched it. The bell, too, shifted once, its metal cool against the side of his thigh. It had not rung since the moor, but it remembered. He did not speak again. There was nothing to say here that the silence hadn't already mourned, so Edric sat with the well, with the trees, with the buried stars, and when the wind finally came, just a breath, just a whisper, it passed over him gently, as if to say, "You are not alone in your remembering." And that, for the first time in years, felt like enough. By the time Edric rose from the well's side, the sky had darkened not with evening, but with the weight of unseen clouds. The air had thickened into a kind of dampness that clung to the skin, not with rain, but with the feeling of something unfinished. It was the sort of weather that made old wounds ache and made stories retold over fires feel a little more real than they should. He followed a trail not made by feet, but by the memory of passage, where the grass grew unevenly and trees leaned just slightly apart. No signs marked it. No cart could have passed, but it was a road nonetheless. The kind that existed only for those with no destination left to name. The forest closed slowly, not menacing but deeply still, each tree like a watcher that had seen far more than it was ever meant to. Lichen bloomed along their trunks like ancient scars, and from high boughs, pale ribbons hung limp in the still air. Offerings, perhaps. Or warnings. There was no telling anymore. Edric's pace slowed. The fog returned, not the cold, silvery kind, but a low, creeping ground mist, tinged with the scent of wet earth and something sourer beneath, like roots that had been disturbed too often. It coiled around his ankles as he walked and swirled when his boots touched the soil, as though reluctant to let him pass. He passed a broken statue half swallowed by ivy, a faceless knight, sword snapped at the hilt, one arm outstretched. Moss had grown over the chest, and where a crest once was, only a hollow remained, as if even stone could forget who it once served. Edric paused beside it, and this time he felt no sorrow, only recognition. The swordless knight. The outstretched hand. He had seen that gesture on battlefields, on scaffoldings, in doorways. It was a plea, or maybe it was an offering. The difference, in the end, was always who had power to take. He placed his hand briefly on the stone's shoulder, its surface cold, damp, unyielding, and moved on. The path dipped into a shallow gully, and the ground changed again. The soil grew darker, richer, wet, but not in the way that breeds rot, in the way that remembers blood. Too many battles had been fought here, long before any kingdom had a name. He did not know their causes. He only knew the silence that followed them. Here the thread in his pouch stirred again, not from wind, from proximity. A low hum vibrated faintly along its fibers like the distant echo of harp strings. Not music, not warning, just memory. At the heart of the gully stood a stone circle, not tall, waist-high and weathered into crookedness. No symmetry to the pattern, no altar in the middle, just a place once used and then left behind. He entered it without ceremony. The fog grew thick at its edges but did not cross the boundary. Inside, the air was still. The silence had depth, the kind that pulled you inward, not like drowning, but like surrender. He stood at its center and unwrapped the cloth from the pouch. The red thread unwound slowly, curling across the stones like spilled ink. He had laid it down in 12 places now. This would be the 13th. He did not know why, only that it felt inevitable. The bell came next. Still silent, but he did not place it this time. He held it and waited. No voice came. No vision, just deep, slow knowing, as if the land itself had opened one eye and seen him clearly. He breathed once, sharply, and the bell trembled. It did not ring, but it knew it could, and somehow that was worse. He wrapped the thread again, carefully, gently, like covering the wound of a friend, and stepped from the circle. The fog did not move, but he did, back onto the road. Back into the long ache of walking, the bell at his side, the thread at his chest, and a memory beneath every step. Beyond the hollow ring of stones, the forest grew old in a different way, not with age, but with absence. The trees no longer bore ribbons, no moss clung to their bark, and no birds dared nest in their boughs. Their branches were skeletal, twisted skyward like limbs reaching toward a god who had turned his face long ago. Edric did not speak. Even his breath felt too loud. The path, if it could still be called that, had become little more than a suggestion, a narrow channel between brambles and bone-white roots that jutted from the soil like remnants of ribs beneath skin. The fog had thinned but remained close to the ground, hugging the forest floor, trailing behind him like a second cloak. And still, he carried the bell. Still, he carried the thread. Each step pressed more firmly into silence. Not the silence of reverence, but the kind bred by fear when even the insects dare not sing. He came to a gate, or what remained of one. Its arch was wrought from iron that had turned black with age, its hinges fused by rust. A faded charm hung from the top, a braided loop of dried heather and dogwood, cracked and eaten through by time. A single red bead still clung to its center. He passed beneath it. The path opened then, not into a clearing, but into something older. A sunken place, ringed by hills too steep to climb easily, where long-forgotten people had once buried their burdens. Stone cairns littered the earth in no order. Some collapsed, others still tall and grim like watchers frozen mid-step. Between them lay shallow dips in the ground, overgrown now but unmistakably shaped by hands. Graves, but not honored ones. No flowers, no markers, just stones and the low hum of wind moving through grass like breath through teeth. Edric knelt by one at random. He could feel it, not a presence, but the residue of pain. These were not knights, not soldiers. These were those who had seen what they shouldn't, who had known what others wouldn't bear, the ones who died for being awake. He reached for the thread. It stirred before his hand touched it, uncoiling slightly, like it too remembered. He laid it across the cairn stone, just once, then drew it back. The bell in his palm warmed, not with heat, but with pressure. Its silence was no longer passive. It had weight, the kind that bends the spine and blurs the eyes. But still it did not ring. And that silence had begun mean something else now. Not absence, but refusal. He stood again and looked out over the grave-filled hollow. It was not vast, it was not even sacred, but it was hidden. The kind of place you only found if you no longer belonged to the world outside it. And perhaps that was why he was here. He walked among the stones slowly, tracing the invisible web between them, how one led to another, how stories ended together, even if they had begun alone. The names whispered to him, not in voice, but in feeling. Lena, Saradwin, Elric, Ariane, not his comrades, not his enemies, just people the sword had forgotten. He left the thread wrapped tightly, the bell tucked close, and when he passed back beneath the gate, the red bead on the charm finally broke loose, dropping silently into the earth. He didn't see it fall, but he felt something shift behind him, like a breath finally exhaled or a burden briefly lifted, and the silence, for just one fragile moment, felt lighter. The hills beyond the forgotten graveyard were bald, hunched like the backs of old men praying to a heaven that no longer heard them. No tree grew there, no vine climbed, just the brittle whisper of grass that had yellowed before its time and wind that spoke only in sighs. Edric climbed slowly. The weight he carried now was not from steel, nor even sorrow. It was older than that, older than vows and wounds and names. It was the weight of having survived what should not have been survived, of walking long after the path had ended. At the crest of the hill stood a cairn, not of burial, but of warning. Stones piled high with intention, their shape too precise for chance. Bones nestled among the rocks. Animal, he thought, though something in his chest disagreed. A rusted pendant had been wedged beneath the highest stone, a knight's sigil, one he did not recognize. He removed his glove and touched it. The metal was cold, smooth, and it hummed. Not like the bell, not like the thread. This was something else, a memory maybe, or a scar burned so deep into the land that even time had failed to erase it. The wind rose suddenly, harsh against his face, and brought with it a scent, ash and iron, the bitter smoke of fire left too long untended. He turned his eyes to the horizon and saw it then, the black mark upon the land, a ruin. Stone buildings half consumed by fire, roofs collapsed inward like the ribs of a dead beast, chimneys reaching up from nothing like broken fingers. No birds circled above, no insects clicked below, just the slow swirl of dust and the distant creak of charred wood shifting in its own decay. He made his way down. The village, if it had ever been one, was small. Perhaps 10 homes, a well, a chapel, all ruined now. Not by time, by hands. Edric stepped over a broken threshold into what had once been a home. The hearth was blackened, bones of chairs collapsed near the ash. On the far wall, half hidden beneath soot, a child's drawing remained. Figures scratched in charcoal, stick limbs, circles for heads. One held a sword, the others torches. He stood there a long time, then turned. Outside, the bell shifted again. A tremor, a low hum, not of fear, but of recognition. He crossed to the chapel. Its door was gone, its roof fallen, but its altar remained. A single beam of light pierced through the ruined ceiling and fell across the stone like the memory of a benediction. Upon it, carved deeply into the surface, were words. He said he was a knight. He said he was here to help. That was all. No signature, no date. Just that. The words hit harder than any blade, because he had said those very words once, more than once, beneath banners in bloodied fields at the gates of burning towns. He said them before he knew what they meant. He said them even after he did. He sat down on the altar step, not as penance, not as ritual, but because he had nowhere left to stand. The bell in his pouch pulsed once, sharp as breath drawn in pain, and for the first time in many days, Edric opened his hand and let it fall. It landed softly on the altar, beside the carved words. It did not ring, but its weight on the stone echoed louder than any voice. He unwrapped the red thread next. It had frayed along the edges, faded with damp and dust. He placed it in a coil beside the bell, and then he leaned forward and rested his forehead against the cold altar stone. He did not pray, he did not weep, he simply breathed and listened for the voice that never came, for the forgiveness that never would. And in that silence he felt it, the memory of fire, the sound of armor cracking as men ran, the shape of a knight made only of ashes, and he knew he had walked into what he had helped create, and now there was no path back. The air outside the ruined chapel was heavy with the weight of smoke and silence, thick enough to wrap around Edric's shoulders like a shroud. He rose slowly from the altar, the rough stone cold beneath his forehead still warming in his memory. The bell and the red thread lay beside the carved words, a quiet testament to what had been lost and what could not be undone. He stepped out into the open, the wind weak and mournful, carrying with it the faint scent of burning wood and a hint of something darker, something like despair. The village lay scattered below the hill, broken and empty, save for the occasional charred beam trembling in the soft breeze. It was a place where no one would return, a graveyard for hopes and oaths broken long ago. Edric felt the weight of the silence pressing in again, the silence that did not comfort but suffocated. He reached into his satchel and drew out the worn book he carried, its pages dog-eared and damp from the journey. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned to a blank sheet and began to write. His hand moved slow, heavy with the burden of each word, as though writing was a final act of defiance against forgetting. An oath taken in youth, weighted by honor and fear, a sword raised for justice, but justice is not always clear. He paused, eyes scanning the empty valley below, where no cheers greeted the fallen, where no songs echoed for the lost. The path of a night is narrow, cut by steel and shadow, and sometimes the darkest wounds are the ones we carry inside. The wind shifted, as if to carry the words away, but Edric held fast. He closed the book, pressed it to his chest, and felt its rough binding like the armor he no longer wore. He turned his gaze eastward, toward the distant hills shrouded in mist, the next stretch of his journey. No grand destination awaited him, no glory to claim, only the slow unraveling of what it meant to be a man who had borne a sword and now sought the fragile peace beyond it. With a final look at the village, Edric stepped down the hill, leaving behind the bell, the thread, and the words carved in stone. The forest welcomed him back with quiet rustling, the shadows folding around him like old regrets. But Edric walked on, because some journeys do not end in triumph, they end in understanding, and the courage it takes to keep moving forward, even when the weight of the past is all that remains. Edric's footsteps grew lighter as he left the ruined village behind, swallowed gradually by the thickening woods. The pines stood tall and thin, their needles whispering secrets in the cold air. The forest was a muted cathedral where the sunlight barely dared to enter, and shadows pooled in the hollows like forgotten prayers. Here, the world seemed paused between breath and heartbeat, and Edric felt the weight of time fold in around him. The soft crunch of fallen needles beneath his boots was the only sound, apart from the occasional distant call of a crow. It was a sound neither threatening nor comforting, simply a reminder that life persisted, even in quiet despair. He carried with him the remnants of his burdens. The bell still cold in his satchel, the red thread folded carefully beneath his cloak, and the worn book pressed against his side like a shield. None of it could protect him from the memories that trailed him like shadows. Deeper into the forest, the trees grew closer, their trunks blackened by an old fire that had scorched this place long ago. The charred earth still held the scent of smoke, mingled with the damp decay of fallen leaves. Edric knelt beside a fallen tree, its wood splintered and hollowed, and traced a finger along the rough bark. It was a relic of destruction, a monument to loss. He remembered a time, long past, when he had stood among knights in shining armor, speaking vows beneath such trees, promising loyalty and courage. Those vows now felt like chains. The silence around him thickened, and a faint movement caught his eye. A small fox, its fur red against the gray-brown forest floor, watching him with unblinking eyes. The creature held still, unafraid, before it slipped silently between the trunks and disappeared. Edric exhaled slowly, as if releasing some part of his burden to the woods. He rose and continued, the path narrowing beneath tangled roots and low-hanging branches. Somewhere ahead, the soft sound of running water called to him, a thread of life weaving through the stillness. He followed it to a small stream, its water clear and cold, cutting through the forest with quiet insistence. Kneeling at its edge, Edric cupped his hands and drank, the chill burning away some of the weariness clinging to his bones. As he looked up, the sky peeked through the canopy, a pale wash of gray, heavy with unfallen rain. He could feel the weight of clouds pressing low, the world waiting in quiet suspense. Edric's thoughts drifted again to the days before his knighthood, the boy who had dreamed of glory, the man who had learned that glory was a bitter thing. The bell in his pack shifted, a faint tremor against the leather. He did not reach for it. Instead, he folded his hands over the cool water and let the forest hold him for a moment, a breath between what was lost and what might still be found. The rain finally came, not as a storm, but a gentle, persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of the world and softened the colors of the forest. Each drop fell like a whispered sorrow, tapping softly against leaves and pooling in hollows worn smooth by time. Edric did not seek shelter. The dampness seeped into his clothes, chilled his skin, but it did not pierce the numbness that settled deep within. The path grew muddier, his boots sinking with each step, leaving footprints quickly erased by the falling rain. The forest around him felt less like a refuge and more like a place waiting to remember, waiting to hold the stories buried beneath its roots and rocks. Ahead, the faint outline of a stone bridge appeared, arching quietly over the stream he had followed. Its moss-covered stones were slick with rain, worn smooth by countless feet that had passed before. Edric crossed slowly, the steady drip of water falling into the river below matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. On the other side, the woods opened to a narrow clearing, where wildflowers struggled for life beneath the heavy sky. Their petals hung heavy with droplets, their colors dulled but stubbornly alive. Here, Edric paused and reached into his pack. From the worn folds, he withdrew the bell, cold and unyielding. He turned it over in his palm, fingers tracing the dull metal, feeling again the silence it held. Around the bell, the red thread coiled softly, frayed and faded, yet still vibrant against the muted world. He knelt among the flowers and placed the bell gently on the earth. Then, with careful hands, he unwound a length of the thread and laid it beside the bell, weaving it slowly through the grass and stone as if binding the land to memory. The rain continued to fall, and for a moment Edric imagined that the thread shimmered faintly, a red river flowing through the green and gray. He closed his eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of rain on leaves, the distant murmur of water, and the hollow echo of his own breath. In that silence, something shifted, not a voice, but a feeling. A pulse, faint and fragile, like the stirrings of a heart long still. Edric opened his eyes and looked to the sky. The clouds had begun to part, thin threads of pale light filtering through the gaps, promising a dawn not yet born. He stood slowly, the ache in his limbs less sharp, the weight in his chest less heavy. He gathered the thread and bell once more, rolled the worn book into his pack, and stepped forward. The road stretched before him, uncertain and unmarked. But he no longer feared its ending. For in the quiet and the rain, amidst the broken and the lost, Edric had begun to understand the faintest trace of peace, a peace born not of victory, but of acceptance. And so he walked on. The road narrowed again, weaving through ancient oaks whose gnarled branches intertwined overhead, casting mottled shadows in the fading light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, an aroma heavy with time's passing and memories left to molder. The woods seemed to lean in closer, holding their breath as Edric pressed onward. Ahead, through the mist, a silhouette appeared, a small chapel, crumbled and roofless, its stone walls moss-clad and broken in places. The windows were empty eyes staring into the gray sky, and a wooden door hung crookedly on rusted hinges. No bell rang from its tower. No light flickered from within. It was a place forgotten, yet somehow refusing to vanish entirely. Edric paused at the threshold. The cold stone underfoot was slick with moss and rain, and the silence inside was profound, heavy with prayers whispered long ago and never answered. He knelt at the altar, now cracked and overgrown with lichen, and opened his book once more. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the worn pages. He did not write. Instead, he placed the bell on the altar's edge and uncoiled the red thread, letting it drift like a river through the dust and moss. The thread wove around broken stones and crumbled pillars, connecting the chapel's scars as if sewing together the wounds of a place abandoned but not erased. The light shifted, pale and thin, filtering through the shattered roof like a benediction. For a moment, the air seemed to thicken, filled with the weight of countless lost hopes and whispered regrets. Edric closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Here, amid the ruins, he felt the faintest stirring, a fragile thread of something beyond sorrow. Not forgiveness, but understanding. Not peace, but the beginning of a reckoning. He rose slowly, gathering the thread and bell, and looked back once before stepping away from the chapel's hollowed heart. The forest awaited, quiet and watchful. and Edric walked forward, carrying the slow, steady beat of remembrance with him. Night had folded the world into a deep, muted blue, where stars hovered like distant candles flickering in a cold draught. The moon hung low and hollow in the sky, a pale lantern that cast long shadows between the trees and stretched Edric's own across the forest floor like a thin ghost. The air was sharp, tinged with the scent of wet pine and earth breathing out the day's slow retreat. Edric moved carefully, guided by the soft crunch of his boots against leaf litter and the faint gurgle of a distant stream. His breath rose in visible puffs, brief whispers that vanished before they could settle. The bell in his pack shifted slightly, silent yet insistent, as if sensing the gravity of the night. The forest felt different under moonlight, not less alive, but quieter, waiting, as if the trees themselves were holding their secrets, reluctant to share what they had witnessed in darkness. Edric's footsteps faltered at times, wary of unseen roots and the sudden rustle of small creatures startled by his presence. After some time, he arrived at a clearing, bathed in the moon's pale glow. The grass was long and tangled, glistening with dew, and in the center stood a solitary oak, its branches reaching wide and twisted, a sentinel against the night sky. Around its base lay scattered remnants of old offerings, small bones bleached white, shards of pottery, faded ribbons entwined with dried herbs. A place sacred once, or at least feared. Edric approached the tree with reverence. He knelt and reached into his pack, pulling out the bell and the thread. The red thread unraveled slowly, a thin line tracing a path from his fingers to the earth, weaving gently through the roots and curling beneath the tree like a heartbeat. The bell rested softly on a bed of moss, its silence heavy. Edric closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the forest beneath him, the slow rhythm of life and death entwined. In the stillness, memories surfaced. Faces long faded, promises whispered and broken, the clash of steel and cries lost to time. He thought of the boy who had dreamed of knighthood, the man who had worn the title, and the shadow that had stretched over both. The wind rose then, a breath stirring the leaves and threading through the branches with a soft susurration. It carried with it a voice, no words, but a feeling, a shiver of sorrow and resolve. Edric opened his eyes. The moonlight caught the bell's curve, casting a faint glow that seemed to ripple across the moss and stone. He stood slowly, brushing damp hair from his brow, and gathered the thread, now woven with the forest's quiet energy. The bell returned to his pouch, its weight no longer just metal, but memory, and perhaps something close to grace. He lingered a moment longer beneath the oak, feeling the night press close, the soft darkness both a cloak and a companion. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he turned back toward the path. The road ahead was long, tangled with shadows and silence. But beneath the hollow moon, Edric walked on, carrying the weight of all he had been, all he had lost, and all that might still be. The forest slowly gave way to a scattering of cottages, their outlines dim and softened by the early morning mist. Smoke curled thinly from chimneys, whispering promises of warmth and the faintest stirrings of life. Yet the village felt distant, not because of space, but because it seemed suspended in a moment stretched thin by time, as if the world itself hesitated to disturb the fragile quiet. Edric moved cautiously through the narrow lanes, the soft patter of his boots muffled by the thick fog curling around stone walls and wooden fences. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and soot, mingled with the distant aroma of baking bread and wood smoke. A faint chorus of cocks crowing echoed somewhere beyond the mist, a lonely call announcing dawn's slow approach. The cottages were small and worn, their thatched roofs sagging beneath years of neglect. Windows were shuttered or clouded with grime, and doors stood half closed, guarding secrets behind faded paint and weathered wood. Edric could feel eyes upon him, watchful, wary, but no voices rose. The village held its breath. He came to the heart of the settlement, where a large stone hearth stood in the open beside a well. The hearth was cold now, blackened with ash, and the stones were cracked with age. Yet even in its silence, it seemed to pulse faintly, an ember waiting beneath the frost. Edric knelt beside the hearth and placed the bell gently on the cold stones. He drew the red thread from his cloak, the frayed strands trembling in his fingers like the last flicker of a dying flame. Slowly, he wound the thread in a careful circle around the hearth, each loop binding the past and present in a fragile covenant. The silence thickened, pressing in with the weight of unspoken grief and long-buried fears. Edric closed his eyes, and in that darkness behind his lids he saw the flicker of fires long gone, the warm glow of kitchens filled with laughter and sorrow, the shadowed faces of those who had sat by the flames and whispered prayers to gods who no longer answered. His hand rested on the bell, cold yet alive with quiet purpose. He thought of the families who had lived here, who had known hunger and hope, joy and loss, of children who had grown up too fast, of mothers who had waited by windows, of fathers who had marched away and never returned. The world outside moved forward, indifferent to their silence. But here, in the hearth's shadow, their memory lingered. Edric rose, brushing the damp earth from his knees, and looked once more at the sleeping village. Somewhere beneath the fog, a door creaked softly. A small sound, but enough to stir the stillness. He did not speak. He only listened, and then, without a backward glance, he turned and walked away. The bell and thread were gone from the hearth, now tucked safely once more in his pack. But the echo of the silence remained, a quiet hymn woven into the fabric of the dawn. Edric stepped into the morning, carrying the weight of countless quiet lives, each one a thread in the slow unraveling of a world he no longer understood. And still he walked on. The morning's light was pale and hesitant, filtering weakly through the heavy clouds that clung to the sky like a worn shroud. The village behind Edric was swallowed slowly by mist, its outlines fading into ghostly shapes among the trees. Ahead, the road stretched forward, narrow, uneven, and disappearing into the gray distance like a fading breath. Edric's steps were measured, deliberate, the echo of his boots muted by the damp earth beneath. His cloak hung heavy with moisture, and the bell in his pack seemed heavier now, not with metal, but with the accumulation of silent stories and unspoken grief. The red thread, folded carefully beside it, felt fragile as a spider's web, but strong as iron in his hand. The forest thickened again, its shadows lengthening under the low, burdened sky. The trees here were ancient and knotted, their trunks scarred by time and flame. The scent of smoke lingered faintly on the breeze, old fire, not new, but still smelling of loss. The earth beneath was soft and dark, scattered with charred leaves and brittle twigs that snapped softly beneath Edric's boots. He stopped beside a clearing where a ring of stones circled a patch of blackened earth. The grass around the circle had been trampled and flattened, as though hundreds of feet had passed through this place, carrying burdens invisible to all but the land itself. Edric knelt, drawing the bell and thread from his pack once more. He laid the bell carefully on the scorched soil and then began to unspool the thread, weaving it slowly between the stones like a fragile lifeline. Each loop was a silent prayer, a memory breathed into the fabric of the earth. The air hung heavy with a tension so subtle it felt almost sacred, a quiet waiting that stretched beyond time. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw faces, young and old, brave and broken, caught in moments of fear and fleeting hope. He heard whispers, not words, but the echo of voices long lost, songs sung softly in the night, lullabies given in desperation, curses spoken beneath breath. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a lone hawk. It wound around Edric, threading through the stones in the red thread, as if weaving him into the story etched into this ground. His fingers trembled as he gathered the thread, winding it back with reverence, tucking the bell into its folds. The weight in his hands was lighter now, yet the sorrow remained, deep and unyielding. He rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees, and cast one last glance at the stone circle, a silent monument to the invisible wounds carried by those who had passed through fire and shadow. The path ahead was uncertain, but Edric's steps held a steadiness born of acceptance. The road was long, the burden heavy, but in the quiet between moments, he carried a thread of something that felt almost like grace. He walked on, into the gray light, beneath the watchful eyes of the ancient trees, bearing the weight of ash and song. The road sloped downward into a wide open plain where no forest grew, and no birds dared fly. The grass here was short, yellowed, and brittle beneath Edric's boots, as if the land had been scorched not by fire but by silence. There were no villages, no huts, no walls. Just open ground that stretched to the edge of the sky and the faint suggestion of ruins far to the east, half swallowed by the rising mist. The wind moved low across the field, dry and cold, whispering in a tongue older than men. It did not howl or cry, but murmured as though reciting something over and over, some long-forgotten name or a litany of sorrow worn smooth by repetition. Edric slowed. He had passed many such places in the months behind him, but this one was different. The emptiness here felt deliberate, as though something had been carved out of the world and never returned. And beneath his feet, the earth felt hollow. He stopped atop a small rise where the ground dipped sharply into a shallow depression, a sunken scar in the earth's flesh. From a distance, it might have been mistaken for a pond or pasture, but up close it revealed its nature. Stone blocks partially buried, jutted out in irregular angles, fragments of something once built, then torn down to the root. Crumbled walls, a foundation maybe, or a grave too wide for one name. Edric stepped down into it. His boots sank slightly into the soft soil. The air was still here, muffled. Even the wind did not follow him into the hollow. It felt like stepping into a memory that did not belong to him. He stood at the center and drew out the bell and the red thread once again. But before placing them, he waited. The stillness held. Then, faintly, the bell trembled in his palm, not ringing, not resisting, but alive in a way that unnerved him. The thread, too, seemed to unfurl on its own, curling gently across the earth, as if retracing lines it had once known. He knelt slowly and laid the bell at the heart of the hollow, then began threading the red line through the scattered stones. As he moved, a sensation grew beneath his hands, not heat, but a strange, humming pressure. The ground was remembering something. Something it didn't want to. Visions came then, not in flashes or voices, but impressions pressed faintly into his mind. A crowd, not cheering, watching, waiting. A woman bound to a post, her eyes not wide with fear, but dull with exhaustion. A man speaking softly to her, his robes plain, his hands stained with ash, the wind rising, and then the sound of flame, not roaring, consuming. Edric's fingers froze, hovering above the thread. He knew this place, not its name, not its date, but its shape. It was not a battlefield, it was not a village, it was a burning ground. And though no stakes stood now, no ash remained, and no names had been carved into the stones, the air still remembered what had happened here. He finished winding the thread, hands trembling. The bell now rested within its circle, mute and still. He did not pray, he did not ask for forgiveness, only witnessed. The weight of the moment pressed deep into his chest, and for the first time in many days he felt tears rise, not hot with grief, but cold, the kind that come from standing too long in silence. He gathered the thread, wrapped the bell in cloth, and stood. The hollow said nothing, but it did not let him go unchanged. He climbed the slope and looked back once, then turned into the wind and kept walking. The field did not forget, and now neither would he. The last road Edric walked was not marked on any map. It wound through low hills, brushed with frost, the grass brittle beneath his steps, and the sky above a washed-out canvas of gray and sorrow. No birds flew here. No beasts moved through the brambles. It was a land abandoned even by its own memory. He had walked long enough that the thread no longer felt like cloth between his fingers, but like sinew, something living, pulsing faintly when the silence deepened. The bell, now wrapped in its final layer of cloth, no longer resisted his touch. It lay still, heavy not with iron, but with finality. The journey had narrowed to this: a man, a bell, a red thread, and a silence so deep it folded into the skin. By dusk, he came upon the ruin. It was older than stone, a circle of earth sunken into the hill, its edges marked by weathered wooden posts so bleached by time they looked like bone. No inscription, no gate, just a faint path worn into the grass and the knowledge that he had been expected. The wind stilled as he stepped into the circle. The world fell into breathless hush. The hollow was empty, no altar, no grave, no monument, but Edric felt it immediately. This was the place he had walked for, the place he had carried the silence toward. It had been waiting for him as surely as he had been drawn to it. He knelt, no ceremony, no audience, only earth and breath and memory. From his satchel he drew the bell. The cloth fell away like a discarded skin. It glinted faintly in the dying light, though no sun remained above. Then the red thread. He unwound it slowly, his hands steady now. With reverent precision, he formed the final circle. Not tight, not closed, a spiral drawn outward from where the bell would sit. The line traced the earth like a whisper. He placed the bell at its center, and for a long moment nothing moved. Then the sound came. Soft at first, a tremble. Not a ring, but a hum. A breath caught between worlds. The bell shivered, once, twice. and then it sang. Not loud, not bright, but clear. A low, mournful note, like the memory of a promise broken and kept all the same. The sound passed through Edric's bones, out into the stones, into the air. It rippled across the hillside like wind through a field of wheat, but nothing bent. The silence didn't shatter, it exhaled, as though the world at last was releasing what had been held too long. The bell faded. The thread lay still, and Edric bowed his head. There was no joy in him, no triumph, only the knowledge that he had walked the road to its end, and that the bell had rung not for him, not for judgment, but for remembrance. He stood once more, lighter than before, bowed, though the sorrow remained. It would always remain, not as punishment, but as a companion. He left the bell where it rested. The red thread, too. They belonged to the land now. As he turned to leave the circle, the wind returned, gentle, cold, almost kind. He did not look back. There was no need. The bell had done what it was meant to do, and the road finally had nothing more to give.